that has killed somebody, could the U.S. actually try this person? And what should be done to be able to...
Well, here's a case where I think there are significant jurisdictional gaps, and CJA would close those gaps. I mean, you know, a lot of the other cases that we've had, you know, you could say the contractor, even if not a Department of Defense contractor, was arguably acting in support of a Department of Defense mission. So you don't have that here. There is, of course, host nation law and host nation courts, and perhaps, you know, that in this case we were not in an armed conflict in Pakistan, technically, then that might be the appropriate venue for such a case.
And just to highlight that other U.S. laws could be applicable. It's just that in this circumstance, there doesn't seem to be an applicable U.S. law. So, for example, in the Pissarro case, where it was, in the Pissarro case, this was a CIA contractor who was reported to have beaten to death a detainee in Afghanistan. And in that case, a criminal case was brought in the United States under the Special Maritime Territorial Jurisdiction. But in order to bring a case under SMTJ, you would have to be sort of either in the the waters, U.S. waters, or sorry, just maritime jurisdiction, or sort of in the possession of sort of a U.S. military base or a territory of the United States. So in this case, it just would be, you couldn't bring it under SMTJ. But there have been other U.S. laws that could be applicable that have extraterritorial application. It's just that in this particular case, it just doesn't, it's unclear whether there could be.
Most of the focus has actually been on contractors killing civilians. There have been cases of contractors killing other contractors, which are actually being prosecuted right now. But there's a much broader question, and I'd like to ask the panel to address the issue of the qualifications of a lot of the contractors that are out there. In particular, Laura raises in the book the CIVPOL and now the various INL contracts basically between the U.S. government and contractors, notably one DynCorp, to train police, first in Bosnia, Kosovo, then Iraq, now Afghanistan. And oftentimes the quality of the police officers that are sent overseas has been quite low in terms of their ability to train, let's say, police officers in Afghanistan or in Iraq in local policing. And I'll give you actually an example from my experience of a Houston police officer that I met in Afghanistan who was very excited about his job. He had spent 20 years in the force in Houston, and he was now earning a six-figure salary, and he thought this was a wonderful salary. And he recounted his first day in Kunar province, where he saw these bright lights up in the sky, and he ran out to see what was happening, and people said, "Take cover." And he didn't understand what was going on. They were like, "This is a mortar attack." And so in his 20 years plus in Houston, he had never encountered that. He wasn't prepared to deal with Afghanistan or the reality of things on the ground. There is actually a school at the U.S. Institute of Peace of Thought, School of Thought at the U.S. Institute of Peace, that what the U.S. needs to be doing is bringing some of these contract authorities back, these contractors into U.S. government jurisdiction, where instead of sending out police officers from a small town in Mississippi or a big town in Texas, we actually need to have a trained group of people that work for the government that go out and do these missions. Laura, in your book, you say that you're not sure that that's necessary, but I'm wondering if you could address that, and perhaps Larry and Melina can jump into this issue of what is sometimes, what could be considered inherently governmental, or something that we really need trained people to do.
Well, I think training is an absolutely critical issue, and we have to think deeply about what training means, because just having, as your example suggests, just having somebody who's been a police officer in the United States doesn't mean that that person is equipped to train police forces in Afghanistan how to do their job. And so whether it's for police trainers or for security contractors or for other categories of contractors, we need to really have very specific, very carefully thought out training and vetting requirements. This is all compounded. The problems are all compounded by the fact that 80% of contractors are not U.S. citizens. And this is not to suggest that non-citizens can't do a good job, but it vastly increases the difficulty in training and vetting. I mean, even for security contractors in Afghanistan, overwhelming majority have been host country nationals. So it gives you some idea of the problem, and I think we have to have much stricter, more stringent rules regarding training.
Larry, do you want to speak?
You've got two issues here. One is what's inherently governmental, and I think particularly since the attacks of 2001 going into Iraq and Afghanistan, we blurred that line. You know, what could only the government do, even if it's theoretically cheaper in the private sector, what should we never contract out? And the other is that the all-volunteer military is a peacetime force. It was never intended to fight long, prolonged conflicts. That's why we make people register. And because we didn't have the political courage to do that, we started relying on contractors, nor did we ever realize how long these conflicts would go, so we were kind of making it up as we went along. And so, hey, we have this mission, we don't have enough soldiers or Marines, so yeah, somebody was a police chief, sure. I mean, one of the hilarious things, if you read about Bernie Kerik, who was a New York City police commissioner who's now in jail, what he did, you know, in Iraq, he had a great time, he didn't do anything, okay? And that's the, you know, that's the problem that you face. So it's really us as a country, and I hope, you know, in addition to clearing up all of the laws and everything, that, you know, when we're out of here, we sit down and say, okay, you know, what is it we want only the government to do? And what is it we're going to do if we, you know, if we go to war again? Are we going to activate selective service so we don't have to completely rely on this? So I think this is really kind of a key thing, and I'd also, Laura talks about it in her book. There is this idea that somehow or another the private sector is always cheaper or more efficient than the public. That's kind of an American myth that, you know, government workers are fat, lazy, overpaid, and all of that type of thing. So it's always better to go to the private sector. Well, even assuming you get the competence, it doesn't always work that way. And I think, again, this is something we need to sit down and take a look at, because I think we got ourselves in a big mess. And the question is, you know, what do we do? What have we learned, you know, going forward here?
Can I just add, just on that point, I mean, I think in the book, one of the things I look at is sort of how did we get here? And I think a big piece of this is what I call the ideology of privatization. That is the belief that the private sector can do things better, faster, cheaper. And in some cases, that may be true. But, well, in the domestic context, we've actually had a pretty sustained analysis of when it's true and when it's not true. The foreign policy privatization happened under the spell of that ideology without really doing the math. And so only now do we have the studies that show, hey, you know what? When you don't have competition on log cap, you get billions of dollars in waste. Now that we have log cap 4 and more competition, hopefully that will help cut some of those costs. But it's always going to be easier politically to add a contractor position than it is to add a government position. And that's part of why we're in such a bind, and we need to make the political case for increasing supervision and oversight of contractors.
Yeah, I would just like to add that what's necessary is that I would absolutely echo that training and vetting is absolutely necessary, and just as equally important is oversight, but that oversight has to be in the field, and it has to be that we're ensuring that when contractors are being serviced to certain tasks and that certain functions, whether it's deemed inherently governmental and then they wouldn't be able to, or whether it kind of gets close to that line, that the government has the responsibility ultimately to ensure that they're overseeing that contractor, and it has to be in the field, and I think that's what's lacked, absolutely.
And you know, one other thing I think is important from a political point of view, we don't count the casualties of the contractors. I'll bet you nobody here can tell me how many contractors have died. We all know how many military people. Yes, you would know. But, you know, basically, we don't. They don't count, okay? Whereas, you know, with the military, we see their pictures on the front of the paper, and the president goes to Dover. And so, and again, that enables us to kind of fight these wars on the cheap from a moral point of view.
And I also think it's important to note that I think we would all probably agree that most, if not many contractors are doing a valuable and courageous service. And like you've indicated, we don't know about the many